And we should be live. Welcome to Thoughtful Money. I'm Thoughtful Money founder and your host, welcoming you back here for a special report live stream on the situation in Iran. We are joined by RANE's Mideast analyst, Ryan Bohl, who's been with us before. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us. I know this is an incredibly busy time for you, that events are developing in real time as we speak here. Very much appreciate you making the time to talk to the Thoughtful Money audience.
Yeah, not a problem, man. I'm happy to be here.
All right. Well, first, Happy New Year. I think the beard's new since we talked. I like it.
It's my this is my winter form. So yeah, for 6 months of the year I go without it, and then the other half that I freeze is where I got to grow it back out.
It's where your younger brother shows up for 6 months. All right. Well, look, let's just dive right in here. I got a bunch of questions, and then we'll try to open it up if we've got time for the viewing audience here. As best you understand it right now with the information we have, what exactly is happening on the ground in Iran right now?
Yeah, we are really in a fluid situation. So these by the hour updates, I think, are really important for everyone to understand and monitor. And what we're getting out of Iran on the ground itself are reports that the protest movement has ebbed. It is not finished, but it is largely suppressed. The Iranians have admitted up to 2,000 casualties, and that includes their security forces of an uncertain number. Other Iranian opposition outlets, like Iran International, have been saying it's up to 12,000. I think that we're going to be looking at a 2,000 to 12,000 range if when all is said and done. Now, like all authoritarian regimes, information is a scarce commodity, so we'll never know the full extent. But we do know that there have been high casualties, and that the protest movement seems to have subsided at the moment. Caveat with that is that tomorrow is Friday. That's a Shia Muslim holy day. People come out of their mosques and they tend to protest as well. So if we're going to see another phase of this, it would start again tomorrow. So that's what's happening on the ground there. The Islamic Republic is still very firmly in control. We haven't seen any cities fall. We haven't seen any territory change hands. And most importantly, we haven't seen any security forces or elites split with the regime, either by criticizing it or, in the case of security forces, by joining protesters. So the domestic situation seems to be more stable than it was a week ago, where it was a very serious challenge to their power and legitimacy. But that's where we are in Iran itself. Then abroad, when we're looking at what happened last night, is the Iranians declared a no-fly zone over their country. They issued aviation notices not to go over Iran. That seems to be in reaction to some American military movements that were not about striking Iran last night. Now, it's possible the Americans are moving assets around to try to find a way to strike Iran without alienating the Gulf Arab allies. That's something that we can discuss later about what the Gulf Arab position is in all of this. But there were no strikes last night. The United States is poised to strike Iran at any time. They have enough assets in Turkey, Qatar, the UAE, in Bahrain's Fifth Fleet to be able to conduct very limited strikes on Iran, on whatever targets they might choose. And B-2 bombers can be flown out of Missouri and in 24 hours can strike any target, even without the bunker busters. They can use conventional weapons, Tomahawks, etc., that can come off of a B-2. So the assets are there, but we do have a report that the USS Abraham Lincoln is being redeployed from the Pacific to the Persian Gulf. It'll take about a week for it to get there. If they are waiting for more significant assets to come into play so they can carry out larger airstrikes, that's a key signpost to watch, is when that carrier arrives. After all, that was part of the Venezuela operation. The Gerald Ford had to arrive, and it was situated. It was part of that operation to extract Maduro. So if they're looking for something bigger, that carrier will matter. Limited strikes are always on the table, could happen at any time, and they could happen while we're talking right now. But a bigger operation requires more significant buildup, and that will take time. And then the last part is some of the alerts that we have seen. Reportedly, Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, their alert has been diminished. While there are still notices from like State Department and others about being concerned about being in the region if you're a citizen, those are not at a critical level where they're ordering evacuations. And we're not seeing the widespread embassy evacuations that we saw last June before the United States joined the Israeli campaign against the Iranians. So we don't have signposts for a major escalation, but we always have this tripwire force within the region that allows for relatively localized escalations if that's what the administration chooses to do.
Okay, great summary. A bunch of targeted questions for you. First off, How many people were involved in this protest? Was it nationwide? Was it a bigger, was it big relative to what's happened in the past?
Yeah, I did.
Scale.
So a qualitative estimate of that is we can do that while saying that it's as big as probably the 2009 so-called Green Revolution protests that emerged after there was a disputed presidential election back then and brought out a lot of people, including fair segments of the Islamic Republic's own base were upset about that election. So it seems to be at least as large as that. And of course, that Green Revolution didn't succeed. It did lead to some reformist trends within the government, but it certainly didn't topple the Islamic Republic. And the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, is still very much in charge in spite of that. So it was a significant number. We could end up with a tally of anywhere between 1% to 5% of the total population being involved. Again, the Iranians are going to suppress the true numbers. It's always going to be hard for us to tell. Mm-hmm. But it was a major and significant protest movement. And in spite of the bloodshed, there's no reason to believe that it can't happen again at a future time, particularly if the Americans and the Israelis decide that they want to weaponize this protest movement and back it overtly. That would encourage protests to emerge somewhere else later down the line.
Okay. And what led to this protest? How did we get here?
Yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, protests are a routine feature of the Islamic Republic. They usually meet them with a combination of force and symbolic concessions. We had a couple in 2022 and 2023. And of course, in the US, protests are a routine feature of our political life as well. Even nationwide protests are normal in the American context. How the Iranians deal with these protests are different in that force element is there and their unwillingness to change is there. So they usually try to outlast these kinds of protests by, targeting specific leaders, targeting specific geographies, especially Tehran. Tehran is critical for control of the country. So if they can suppress the protest movement there, other lingering protests in Iranian Arab territory, Iranian Kurdish territory, or even in some of the poorer areas in the hinterland that are Persian, those don't matter nearly as much as the ones that are happening in the metropolitan center. The other part that they always keep an eye out for is how the Shah fell, which was through strikes in the oil industry. When the oil workers went on strike, that crippled the economy overnight. That caused the Shah's army to waver, and then things fell apart from that point on. So they're always keeping an eye on the oil industry. There weren't any strikes this time around. They've ideologically, influenced the oil industry to make sure that the workers and the managers are aligned with the Islamic Republic as much as they can. So the true believers are the ones in charge of that industry on purpose, because if the oil industry goes on strike or goes offline, that's a big problem. So when it's saying all of that, what drove them is the economy is terrible and has been terrible for a while because of, in part, U.S. sanctions and in part because of Iranian policy choices. One of the big triggers that I think that we've kind of been overlooked is Tehran is having a water crisis. There's talk of evacuating the capital. They probably won't do that. But this water crisis is a result of years of lack of investment in water safety and water saving infrastructure to ensure that the capital is habitable. And there was a specific bank failure that happened that caused the merchants to come out in Tehran's bazaars. And that's why the Islamic Republic responded so forcefully, because this is how the Shah went down. It was an economically focused bizarre revolt, and it spread from there. If there was a true election in Iran, the current government would probably only get 10 to 20% of the vote, and they would be voted out. That 10 to 20% is more than enough for an authoritarian government to stay in power. But that's how they've always been, is they're always concerned that kind of sleeping majority will wake up because of economics. And that's what happened this time around.
Okay. And how influential was the U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear facility? I was interviewing Peter Turchin a few months ago, who's done a lot of studies about basically how nations fall into decline and how revolution happens. And one of the key elements in all of them is the populace basically loses faith in the regime's ability to take care of them, or it sees the regime, on its back legs. And obviously, provided that the people in Iran were aware of what happened to their nuclear facility. I don't know how tight the news control is there, but obviously that's a sign of like, hey, we're not winning if they're taking out our nuclear facilities.
That was a notable blow to especially Ali Khamenei's legitimacy. Remember, he's been in charge of Iran since 1989. He's been around for a long time. And in that time, he's always been kind of conservative, small c, with some of his foreign policy, avoiding confrontation with the U.S., avoiding confrontations with the Taliban. Once massacred a bunch of Iranian diplomats back in the 90s, and that would have been a casus belli for war. Khamenei deferred from that. That's kind of his way of doing things, is trying to use proxies rather than put Iran's own skin on the line. And that strategy arguably hasn't worked. Obviously, the proxies have been devastated. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis haven't been devastated, but they're not acting as a very good shield for the Iranians because of their remote geography. And so for Khamenei, I think that there is a legitimacy crisis. And there was an awful lot of speculation that what could come out of this is a potential power evolution where Khamenei's authority is either diluted or he's actually sidelined. And there's even more conspiracy-based speculation that Trump is about to Maduro Khamenei and extract him from the country, and to do so on behest of a lot of Iranian insiders who have a fair bit of questions about why this man is still in charge when many of his biggest strategic calls have resulted in deeper isolation, have resulted in direct attacks on the country, and have resulted in this severe economic crisis that he doesn't seem to have a strategy to get out of. So there is a real challenge to his specific leadership, but Iran's system is multi-layered. You don't want to think of it as a Saddam Hussein style dictatorship where it's all through one man. There's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. Their career ladder is built through martyrdom.
Not dissimilar to Venezuela, right? Where it's just the whole system is stacked with Chavez and Maduro cronies. So you remove Maduro, everybody else is still there. Yeah,
exactly. And you can almost think of it as like the former Soviet Union, which the Islamic Republic also borrowed from. No single leader in the Soviet Union was instrumental to it being held together. It failed on multiple levels. That's why it collapsed. The IRGC controls a significant part of the economy. It has a significant support base. And for the people living under that umbrella, living in Iran is pretty nice. They have middle class or upper middle class lifestyles. They can still get the vacations that they want. They can still get the housing and the cars that they want. And they are willing to use force to maintain that lifestyle. That's how a lot of authoritarian regimes still work. And of course, the IRGC is in charge of selling this oil to China, which China still does at scale. And that is enough to fuel the survival of this particular government. But the pressure for it to evolve is strong. It can't just stick with the Khamenei style rule where they can pretend to be independent and they don't change any of their ideals from the 70s, and they're not looking for new partners, and they're not looking to violate their sovereignty by allowing the Russians or the Chinese to set up bases in their country. There's enormous pressure that Iran needs to, one, align with a great power, and two, evolve its domestic policies to get out of this economic crisis. And Khamenei doesn't seem to be interested in any of that evolution.
Okay. Hence the displeasure of the remaining 80 to 90% of the populace there. All right. There's a question that's been asked here a couple of times in the chat. I'm going to tweak it a little bit. The question is was the currency devaluation the result of manipulation? This is a version of the question. Manipulation of the real by Western intelligence agencies. More the spirit of the questions that I've been getting here is, did this protest really, was it driven by covert Israeli and U.S. operatives, and this maybe isn't necessarily an organic protest of the people or uprising of the people? It's something that's been fomented by outside powers.
So it was fueled and fanned by outsiders, including the former crown prince of the Shah, who's got close ties.
Sure, but that makes sense. He's going to root for anything that's happening.
Exactly. He wants his dad's job back. Good luck with that. But the short answer is yes. There are always intelligence agencies specifically, and of course, Mossad's ground game in Iran is still quite strong. This is a product of Iran's dysfunctional economy, its corrupt system that allows spies to penetrate your system. So Mossad is, as we saw in June of 2025, all over Iran. They are probably supplying, activists with ways that they can carry out protests. Some of the small arms, I wouldn't be surprised at all if that came from Mossad. That being said, it is impossible for an intelligence agency to foment unrest out of nothing. If the Russians could do that, they would have done that to America 1,000 times. At this
there has to be dry tinder. Yeah,
exactly. There has to be dry tinder, and that is a product of Iran's government's own choices. So they can worsen the situation, they can target the situation, but they don't hold the ability to carry out these large-scale protests if people don't want to show up on their own. They can just amplify the narratives that are already something that Iranians sort of believe on their own, or they can activate, Iranians who weren't thinking about it, and, they can make the narrative louder. But if people don't already have natural sympathy for the cause, it won't work. And so it only works in the case of a legitimacy vacuum, which the Islamic Republic has been facing for some time, and Khamenei's own role in it has made it worse. And the economy, of course, is making it this massive chasm.
Right.
The idea of the West manipulating the currency, I don't think that the CIA or Mossad really needs to do much to that, because U.S. sanctions have already cratered the rial, and the Iranians have resorted to printing over and over again to try to get out of their economic crisis. And as we know, that really tends to lead to hyperinflation rather than solution to your economic problems.
And I've got a few more questions before we really dig into the U.S. the future here. But Trump announced at least a 25% tariff on any country that trades with Iran.
Yeah.
How material is that?
It's still something we're sorting through, because Trump's tariff threats sometimes are implemented and sometimes are not. Some of those major trading partners are key American partners as well. The Turks, the Emiratis, the Emiratis might be rivals with Iran, but Dubai does an enormous amount of trade with the Iranians and always has. 25% tariff on the UAE could jeopardize the American airbase that the U.S. wants there. If it applied to energy, it would obviously be a massive energy tax on American consumers. So I don't think that it'll be implemented in an expansive way. And it may not be implemented at all, especially if it's decided to be overlapped with pre-existing tariffs. That might be a choice. Turkey is facing this digital service taxes investigation that could also get them a 25% tariff. The Trump administration may say, well, it's 25% for both, and then just move on with that as a bigger way to try to pressure Turkey into changing its economic policy or its digital services policy. So the answer is, we don't know if that's going to be implemented, and it may not be. And there's strong reasons for it not to be imposed across the board.
Okay. Do you expect it to add additional weight, though, to the existing sanctions, or just, hey, we'll give it weight when we see it?
I think that a lot of these countries, Turkey and the UAE and other countries in Brazil that have always been doing business with Iran, are going to do a wait and see approach. It may cause some interruptions in the quarter, especially as they try to assess whether or not these are realistic threats. If they don't become realistic threats, I think companies will go back and do business. They've already been bypassing American sanctions for a while, and this is already a high-risk endeavor. So these are risk-friendly entities that are doing business in Iran. This is part of the kind of industry that they've chosen to be in. So they'll probably assess, and then if it doesn't end up being too severe, they'll go back to business as usual. Okay.
And so, Ryan, what do the protesters want? For the people that are uprising, what would they like to see?
And that's they don't know. In a short answer, there are an awful lot of different factions within Iran that make it very hard for there to be a single unified message as to what they want out of this protest movement, because it ranged from, we just want the economy to function, it's the economy stupid kind of protesters who just want the currency to be stable. They just want hyperinflation to end, et cetera.
Right. You usually don't grab a shotgun for that, though.
You usually don't. Yeah. Well, I mean, in some cases,
depends how bad it gets, but yeah.
Yeah, that's where that's the American Revolution started economically focused, right?
No, that's true. Yeah.
So it's something that can evolve into a political demand, but there were plenty of opposition figures who want anything from the return, of course, of the crown prince, which is very much a minority. Some who want simply reforms within the current Islamic Republic. They want the reformist wing of the government to be given more power to oversee things. And they have one concession. It's important to note that in 2022, 2023, the hijab protests over that woman who was killed by the morality police, in the aftermath of that, the Iranians pulled back their morality police. And now a lot of women, especially in Tehran, wearing more or less whatever they want and not going without the hijab, not going, in the hijab, because the Republic said that it's smarter for us to not enforce on this. This is a social trigger point. It's not worth it for our legitimacy. So there's also those folks that just wanted social reforms. And that diversity of opposition and that diversity of voices is one of the reasons this protest movement struggled and struggles and will struggle to gain ground against the Islamic Republic, because the theocrats know what they want. They have a unified vision and a unified, essentially they have their governing Quran that they've got to keep them all in line. The opposition is busy arguing with each other in the streets as to what they want next. And it goes between, there are still some radical leftists in the country. Of course, there are the Iranian Kurds who want autonomy and secession. All of these different factions make it hard to have a unified movement, which plays into the regime's hands.
So sitting here in the cheap seats in the West, knowing very little about Iranian culture and what's going on there, I think we Westerners have a sense that, and it may be an incorrect sense, so please correct me if it is, that if given their druthers, the majority of Iranians would want to get out from under theocratic rule, and they'd rather go to, I don't know, I mean, maybe a democracy, but just something that's not, living under religious mullah control. Is that accurate, or?
I would say it is something that exists amongst an element of the population. Your exiles in the West would feel the strongest in that direction. And that's part of the reason they're exiles in the West. And they'd like to bring that kind of lifestyle back to Iran.
Because Iran had a lot of Western values, we'll say, or at least Western cultural norms, up until they deposed the Shah, right?
Well, in Tehran and in and around the middle class of Tehran is where, when we see all those pictures of Iran before the revolution.
Yeah, the women in bikinis and
Yeah, it's exactly. It's the equivalent of taking photos of people in Greenwich Village and saying America before whatever. It was a hyper-specific location and time.
Okay.
And most of Iran at that time was still widely conservative, didn't have electricity, didn't have running water, looked in some cases kind of like how Afghanistan looks today. And you don't see those photos because, nobody had cameras in those areas.
Cameras didn't make it out there, yeah.
Right, exactly. So there's an information bias in favor of those middle-class people who had the wealth to buy those cameras. And of course, those are exiles who brought it with them when they left. So Iran was by no means a liberal society in the 60s and 70s, and it wasn't becoming a liberal society. That's why the revolution took place, was because many of these conservatives in places like Qom, one of the holiest cities for them, and Isfahan, saw Iranians behaving in ways that they thought were un-Muslim. And that's why the fundamentalist backlash took place, is because back then, the 80% wanted women to cover up and wanted religious rule. And while the 20% or even less in places
because it was culturally conservative in an Islamic culture. Got it.
Yes. Yeah. And of course, that was a fundamentalist wave that was happening globally, happened in America too. And so there was an independent of this global fundamentalism that was kind of sweeping the world in the 60s and 70s. Now today, it's a little bit more flipped. And again, the diversity of the opposition is a problem, where there are some who want a secular democracy, Western style, live like Europe kind of thing. They tend to be focused in Tehran itself. They tend to be younger. You would call them millennials or Gen Z. And of course, 10 years ago, when the Iran nuclear deal was signed, there was an awful lot of hope that by offering economic growth to these groups, that they'd be able to moderate the Iranian government and slowly take control of the bureaucracy. And then you get a Gorbachev moment where one of them finally gets to a position where they can change the fundamental nature of the Islamic Republic. That was kind of the hope some 10 years ago. Yeah. There's many of them that still have that attitude, but there is also still a feeling of there's still an affinity towards religion. Shia religion is critical for Iranian identity. So there's plenty that don't want to get rid of the mullahs. They just want them to behave differently. They might not like Khamenei, but they don't want to get rid of the supreme leader role. They just want somebody who's going to get the water running again. They want to get rid of corruption. They don't necessarily want to get rid of the IRGC. So there's nationalists that are mixed in there. There's religious-minded folks that are mixed in there. There's working-class folks. And of course, the regime's own supporters, they just want the status quo, or a status quo that's less dangerous for them. If the reforms will get the protests to go away, the regime insiders are fine with allowing those kinds of protests. So, and as we move into this global, not necessarily anti-democratic moment, but as we go into a moment where liberal democracy is not exactly advancing in most places, many Iranians are seeing that same trend, and they don't necessarily want Western-style democracy because it might involve chaos. And they have seen what democracy looks like in Iraq, which paralysis, bouts of violence. Iraq is no better off in terms of material goods than
or
it was.
Libya, or other places where Yeah,
exactly. So there's not that clean invitation, and that's another problem for the opposition. What political model can they pitch that would unify people? And there's no political model, I would argue, globally that has consensus pretty much anywhere. I think you'd be struggling to find a country. You can find some smaller countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, et cetera. There's consensus there, but they're smaller, and those consensus are stressed as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it sounds like Iran is a really tough place for regime change to occur organically, because the landscape is so fractured. The parties want different things, so doesn't seem that there's a common cause that's clear for them all to rally around here. That's a big issue. Obviously, there's tight-fisted state control that wants to tamp down anybody who's trying to advocate anything different than the status quo anyways. So you've got that going on too. One would think that the internet would make the desire for reform easier, because people can see how other people in other parts of the world are living, and easier for people to kind of share ideas. And even if you're not gathering in the real world to discuss your resistance, you can gather online to do it. I know right now the country is under pretty much an internet blackout that's being enforced by the state. What's it like normally there? I mean, do they pretty tightly control internet access anyways?
Yeah, there's blockers, but of course VPNs can get around them for sophisticated Iranians. Iran's a relatively well-educated country for the region, but I would put it behind places like the UAE and Saudi and Qatar, the Gulf Arab states. Mm-hmm. It's still, you might describe it as America in the 80s or the 90s in terms of its educational attainment, which also means how easy it is for people to access the internet and come up with these clever workarounds. So the bulk of Iranians, they tend to respect the firewall. They tend to respect the information narratives. It's also important to note, and Iran is no different than many other countries within the region, which is that it's a hierarchical society on a cultural basis. That is, that people tend to look for a clear, natural leader. Here in the US, like, you have a manager, you want to have a beer with them, you want to be able to have some jokes with them. You expect equality because that's part of American culture. In Iran, you would never expect your manager to have a beer with you, and you certainly wouldn't want your politician to look like they're the average everyman. You want your politician to look like they're strong and they're in charge. Those are cultural qualities that don't tend to lead towards democracy or the idea of kind of, again, Western liberalism, so to speak. Instead, the challenge is for many Iranians, if they were looking at a political model and they wanted to copy it, I would argue most of them are looking at Dubai, and they're saying that Dubai is the place that I'd like to live. It's still got a sheikh. It's authoritarian. You can't say what you want. Who cares? They all have material goods. They're all taken care of. They have a, quote, nice lifestyle. And I think that's
kind of their aspiration.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I think Dubai is the regional aspiration for many people. I think Iranians are still in that same mold. The problem with that, of course, is that Dubai enjoys Abu Dhabi that has tons of oil and can always backstop when things go bad. Iran has tons of oil, but a massive population that it has to support with it. It can't do that sort of, the rabbit out of the hat thing with oil the way that the Emiratis can. So there's an aspiration that they'd like, but they can't actually follow because of the nature of geography and demography.
Okay. So, all right, let's get to the US here. So, you've shared with us in the past kind of the history of the relationship between Iran and the West. US would love to see the theocracy there go away. And it would love to see a more West-friendly form of governance there. Iran's been a huge thorn in the West's side, cozying up with America's or the West's adversaries, Russia, China. It's been a huge sponsor of terrorism. It's probably what's kept the Middle East as such a powder keg for so long, because it's been funding, all the terrorist organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas and all that stuff. So America would love to see this populist uprising succeed, the regime collapse or get replaced by something else. Again, that's a little bit more West friendly. So I guess in the immediate term here, what's your best sense of what the U.S. is likely to do here, especially given the president's threats and his recent performance of delivering on his threats when it came to Venezuela?
Right. And of course, we always have to caveat everything. Trump's got a volatility to his policy. But we do know his broad patterns, which is that he likes escalation. That's very
Trump volatile. What are you talking about, Ryan?
yeah, just uncertain, perhaps we can call it uncertain.
You got the right adjective there.
But escalation followed by rapid de-escalation is his favorite. That's what he did in June of 2025. It's what he did against Soleimani. It's what he just did against Maduro. He doesn't want to get dragged into even what they did in Yemen last year against the Houthis, which was inconclusive. It didn't convince the Houthis didn't stop shooting ships until the Gaza ceasefire in October, and it was weeks and weeks and weeks of heavy bombardment. Cost a lot of money. A fighter jet crashed into the ocean. That's not his personal preference. It's not his political style, and there's no political upside to an extended campaign against the Iranians. So I think one of the important documents to look at is the National Security Strategy that came out in November. And it talked explicitly about in the Middle East, we're getting out of the business of not just nation building, but telling governments what they want to do politically. And that was kind of a reference to his first term where Jamal Khashoggi was assassinated by Saudi agents. And there was a huge amount of pressure on the Trump administration to impose sanctions on the Saudis over human rights. That was the Trump administration's insiders saying, if human rights serve our end, we'll grasp onto it. If it doesn't, we won't. We're not going to be categorically pro-human rights. We're not categorically pro-democracy. We're not categorically pro-anything except for our own interpretation of our interests. Notably, he has not grasped onto Iranian oil the way he has Venezuelan oil. He hasn't interpreted that the U.S. has a stake in getting Iranian oil back on the market. He seems to be focused on the Venezuelans for now. It's always a possibility that he decides that Iranian oil should be American oil and we should go back into business together. That kind of volatility exists. But right now,
do we have infrastructure over there the way that we did in Venezuela?
No, we don't. So. Right, that's part of it. Right, that's part of the story. It's the Americans have been out of Iran since '79. That doesn't mean that he can't resurrect this old story of the 50s and 60s when the U.S. was very much invested in Iran's oil industry. So that can be something that he decides to do on a narrow interest of like, I want to bring cheap energy to Americans as part of my affordability plan. But we haven't seen that, right? I think what this administration wants to do under Trump is shape Iran in a pro-Trump direction. And what that specifically means is a combination of both appeasing Trump personally by meeting his demands, but also meeting his political base's demands, which is, in one case, meeting Israel's demands. And the tightness between Netanyahu and Trump has been displayed again and again, despite some ruffles here and there. Israel wants Iran to be defanged, and it wants it to be fundamentally, ideologically a different thing. It doesn't care if it's a democracy, but it does want the IRGC to decide that their main problems are at home or against Pakistan or against the Afghans, just not against Israel, not supporting Hamas or Hezbollah or any of these other anti-Israeli proxies. And that also involves dismantling the nuclear program, destroying the missile program, changing their foreign policy entirely. And Israel's demands therefore become Trump's demands, as he's got this affinity for Israel's own perception of security within the region. But Trump I don't think cares if it's a democracy that does this, if it's an IRGC hardliner that just kills all of his opposition and replaces them with people that will get along with Washington. That's the wide trajectory. The question is, how far will Trump go to get that? And of course, how much time does he have in terms of political capital at home before, say, Congress decides to limit his powers to do so? Moving into midterms, we saw a War Powers Act just fail against Venezuela. That doesn't mean that after the midterms, a War Powers Act won't pass or that Americans won't become sick of these kind of military adventures and demand that there be constraints on Trump. So does he interpret this as, I only have a year for a free hand to act as hard and as fast as I can to reshape Iran's behavior? Or do I have 3 years, Or is Iran just not that important to me personally for my legacy? The Western Hemisphere is. All of our efforts should go into Venezuela and Cuba and Mexico and Colombia. That's something that I don't know if we have a clean answer to. We just know that he's chasing all of these imperatives all at once, well aware he's only got 3 more years left in the White House.
Okay. Let's see here. I've got a question that my mind wants to go to, but I want to get there through a different path here. Okay, so what do you think the U.S. is most? Well, I guess I'll get to that question, but just before that, I've heard it recently described that Trump / America is now not interested in pursuing regime change as it is in pursuing regime influence. And Maduro is probably a good example of that, right? We're not going into Venezuela and rounding up everybody who was part of the old regime and throwing them in prison and then holding flash elections and letting just a totally brand new regime take over. Probably because that would be really intractable and come with a ton of risk and take forever. And Trump probably doesn't have the political capital for that, whatever. So instead he says, well, then I'll do regime influence. I'll take out the top guy. I'll put number 2 in there and I'll say, do what we tell you to do, or else you're going to suffer the fate of guy number 1, right? Do you see that as, it sort of sounds like you're saying that's probably going to be more Trump style here with Iran.
Yes, I think regime influence probably is the best. I might steal that. That's
do it. It's not mine, but steal it. Yeah.
May borrow you, but regime influence really is the strategy with the Iranians, is to reshape what they do, make them less of a threat to America and its allies. The trick is, though, Iran's ideology and its political system is wedded to anti-Americanism, going back to '79. The death to America is still part of
the great Satan. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So, whereas Venezuela and Maduro, they were more ideologically squishy on this front. They had worked with the Americans before, and there had been relations, and then they deteriorated. There's not that relationship with the Iranians or any of the current insiders. So how does one do that? And it looks like it is in some ways similar to the intractable relationship between Israel and Hamas, also two ideological actors who want two very different worldviews and then, are willing to fight over it. Iran wants the region to be free of the United States and its influence. The United States can't leave the region because of energy and trade, etc., terrorism as well. That creates your recipe for conflict right there. Is that Iran, as a significant middle power, believes the Middle East belongs to at least its partial sphere of influence. It'll share it with the Turks, with the Egyptians, or the Saudis. It doesn't want to share it with an extra regional power like the United States. So how does one overcome that? You've got to be looking at a more effective way of what the British did to the former Shah. And that was relatively easy because that was a monarchy. That's a personalist system. Replace one Shah with another, replace a prime minister with another, you get a more amenable regime. But of course, it didn't last, right? It only lasted 25 or so years before that strategy fell apart. The Americans are probably looking at what the Israelis did last June, where they assassinated significant numbers of Iranian hardliners, and looking to see if the succession process kind of convinces people to move into a more moderate or at least non-confrontational direction. Now, there's good reason to believe that
direction where they're not going to get assassinated.
Yes, exactly. But there's good reason to believe that won't work. Iranian Islamist thought is very heavy on martyrdom. This is the way you get into heaven. This is part of the career ladder. Dying against the hated enemy is something that people kind of want to do. And until that feeling and ideology is exhausted, potentially through generational turnover, you're looking at an open-ended campaign of assassination where you never kill one person who matters so much that everything changes. Instead, you're looking at a significant years-long effort of killing people until you've killed enough that a younger generation has come along and said, well, I never really believed in this Islamism thing anyway. That's a really uncertain strategy. I don't think I've ever seen it successfully done in the modern world. We're still killing Al-Qaeda and ISIS leaders left and right. I think we killed some more last week. They keep regenerating. As long as that belief system remains intact.
Okay, I got a whole bunch of questions here for you. Just kind of on that, to the average Iranian, is the U.S. still the great evil? Do they wake up thinking death to America, America's the great Satan? Or are they kind of like, the mullahs say what they got to say and I'll chant because they want me to, but I'm just going to get on with life and I want to watch my American movies and hopefully get some cigarettes and Levi's?
And I would actually extend that feeling to the Israelis as well. I would argue that for especially Iranians under 45 or so, and as I'm getting up there as a millennial, I've got to remember now we got to be under 45. But as millennials and Gen Z tend to see these conflicts as conflicts of their parents' generation, they have not seen any material gains from them. It's best not to have an opinion on them, right? Because if you have the non-mainstream opinion over there, that's how you lose jobs and you get into fights and so on and so forth. I think many Iranians just want to get on with their day with these external conflicts, but there's still an incentive structure to go along with the ideology. If you want to go into government, in the bureaucracy or politics, you have to say the slogans and follow through on them whenever you can. If you want to, curry favor with somebody who's corrupt, who can get you a better water supply or get you housing, again, you have to curry favor by chanting the slogans and doing things like that. So there's still a political currency that comes along with the ideology that people will play along with, and that sometimes they feel the need to act with. And again, last year when Israel and the US bombed Iran, that was a moment where a lot of pressure was taken off the government, because everybody rallied to the flag, and nobody likes the country being attacked, no matter how much they hate their government. It's all in the family, right? I can say that about my dad, but nobody else can. Right. So there's that element as well. So when there's external pressure, people will rally to the Islamic Republic. But when they're left alone, they start to say, well, why aren't the lights turning on? Why isn't the sewer running? So on and so forth. Who's responsible for this?
But is it, I guess what I'm trying to get to is it performative mostly? You bomb us, I'm going to be mad for a while. Or is it existential? Like, I'm willing to grab a rifle and go fight, in the Iran forces against the great evils of Israel and the West.
I guess it depends on the scenario. Like if there was a U.S. invasion of Iran, it's a safe assumption that there would be a significant insurgency that would last many years, just like Iraq, out of people who previously didn't think anything about America, but now that there are troops on the ground in their town, now that you're
in my country, I'm standing up.
Yes, exactly. So how you take that sentiment, if you're looking for a regime change scenario as a strategic planner, how do you take that sentiment of all these people, they just want to go out and get cigarettes. They just want to go on vacation to Turkey or to Dubai, and channel that into anger against the regime that is strong enough to change its nature. It's a really tricky thing, because as soon as you apply external pressure to that type of person, they say, you can't tell me what to do. You're not even from here. What are you talking about? And then they react to it. And then they get closer to the adversary you're trying to overthrow. And this is what intelligence agencies struggle with, is finding narratives that don't look like they're sponsored, but do change people's political behavior.
Okay. And what is Iran's relationship to the rest of the Middle East right now? In other words, or maybe put it this way, what's the rest of the Middle East power players? What are they thinking about this? Are they taking Iran's side? Are they affronted? Do they want to see Iran knock down a couple of pegs?
They would like, most of them, except for Israel, want it to just go away. What they specifically want is they would love for Iran to be non-confrontational, to behave like Turkey or behave like Saudi Arabia, where they assert localized interests that they can manage, not this overarching ideological project to dominate the Middle East and spread Islamism all over the place. They want Iran to move away from that. When Iran and Pakistan were firing missiles at each other, I think it was the beginning of last year, 2025, that didn't inspire a lot of alarm throughout the region, because it made sense to them. This is a localized border dispute. They don't want the Baluchis independent, neither the Pakistanis. They got involved, and so on and so forth. That's what they would like to see out of the Iranians, rather than them sponsoring the Houthis to break up Yemen, or sponsoring PMUs in Iraq to undermine the cohesion of a multi-ethnic and sectarian Iraqi state. They want the Iranians to move away from those big projects and become more nationalists, like all of them are becoming. The Saudis are becoming more nationalist, the Turks, the Israelis, the Emiratis. They want Iran to do that because they can cut deals with a nationalist Iran. It's harder to cut deals with an ideologue. An ideologue is my way or the highway. Nationalists, on the other hand, and I would argue Trump is a nationalist, you can cut deals with them for narrow interests, and you can understand their behavior a lot better. Escalation becomes more manageable until hyper-nationalism comes along, and then you end up in things like World War I. But nationalists generally, at least in our current phase, are easier because you understand what they're after. So if you're the Saudis or the Emiratis or the Qataris, and the poor Qataris have tried so hard to be neutral, and they've gotten hit twice in the past year from an American ally and from the Iranians, and they might get hit again if the Americans move on Iran again. They all want a pattern of de-escalation and a path towards some sort of post-Islamic republic nationalism, but they don't want to push on Iran. Iran's got missiles. They have air defenses that are imperfect. They have, especially the Gulf Arabs, have very fragile diversification models that are reliant on people believing that these are safe places, and you can't sell that image if a ballistic missile is flying overhead every couple of months. So they don't want to push on Iran to change their behavior. They're trying to stand aside as much as they can. And so when these inevitable cycles of escalation take place, they're not on the top of Iran's targeting list. That's what they're aiming for. But there is some interesting undercurrents of that, which is, the Saudis and the Pakistanis now have an overt defense pact. Turkey wants to join that defense pact. The Qataris are trying to get the Americans to be more reliable on the defense front and get an extra defense pact there. So the Saudis have gotten one as well. So they're all looking at different ways of rebuilding their security that is short of just relying always on the Americans, and is also short on confronting the Iranians. It's more about trying to set up new tripwires that changes Iran's perceptions, because Iran is paranoid about being diplomatically isolated, militarily isolated. They're trying to set up these tripwires where now if you're in Tehran and America's just attacked you, well, maybe the smarter thing to do now is to shoot at an American ship rather than at Qatar, because if you fire at Qatar again, they'll join this Turkish defense pact. And then Turkey will be involved in a war with you the next time you attack Qatar, and you don't want that. So there's all of these lower layer geopolitical moves that are taking place underneath the surface of these countries that are trying to find their footing in a world where America isn't everywhere and doesn't want to be and isn't capable of being everywhere, and where their adversary Iran isn't all powerful and all dangerous, but is disruptive enough to their own economic and political models that they're trying not to antagonize it.
Okay. So what I take from that, and correct me if this is the wrong takeaway, is a lot of the players in the rest of the Middle East would actually love to see the Iranian theocracy be replaced with a more nationalistic government.
I mean, they would take an IRGC nationalistic government too. They would take it if Khamenei woke up tomorrow and said, now I am an Iranian nationalist and this is the end of the Islamist era. I don't think they have picked there's obviously more realistic leaders in that path that they would like to see come to power. But yeah, that's the overarching goal that they could get is to get Iran to behave more like, say, the Russians do in the region, or the Turks do in the region, where they can understand their behavior and their pursuit of national interests, and they can cut those deals with, well, this is your sphere of influence, this is ours, you care about this trade route, and we care about that one, and we'll trade things off.
Okay, but it's, again, the impression I'm taking from this is, they're probably not getting too wound up by what Trump is threatening to do here, right? Because it's all right now, at least in the regime influence camp, that, okay, maybe this will actually kind of keep the mullahs, or keep the current Iranian government a little bit more contained after this if Trump's successful.
Well, there's that volatility element is, I think, what they're worried about, because each time the Iranians have fired missiles in response to American strikes, and I have to double check on whether or not Qatar's domestic investment or foreign direct investment was affected by the strikes last year. But every time that happens, people pause their business in these places. Yeah. That's time they can't make up as the world moves away from oil and develops alternative energies. They're very sensitive to that. So they certainly they want Trump. They don't mind if Trump is necessarily rhetorically escalatory against the Iranians, because that doesn't inspire Iranian counterattacks. But they know that they're first in line for retaliation if the U.S. or Israel decides to strike the Iranians. So they don't want the U.S. getting involved militarily if they can help it, because each time it's not the Americans that are paying the price for this. It's really Gulf Arab security that is paying the price.
Okay. All right. So let's get to the key question of the whole live stream here, which is, what, in your opinion, in Ryan's opinion, is the more likely thing for the U.S. to do here? Trump has threatened some sticks. Maybe some carrots are being offered behind the scenes. I don't know. But what do you think the U.S. is most likely to do here over the next couple of weeks?
In this quarter, the United States, we have to watch those military assets to see our scale. But the idea that the U.S. has taken strikes off the table, I think that you'd still need to keep it at 50-50 over the next few weeks as Trump makes the assessments and the internal adjustments to decide whether or not striking now is worth it. Now, in the longer run, both throughout the quarter and the year, we do expect new strikes on Iran, whether that's from Israel or the United States.
Okay. And hitting what? Targeting what?
Probably either the nuclear program and the missile program again, or in reaction to some protests, expanding that outwards to political targets to try to destabilize the regime and convince them to come back to the negotiating table, which would essentially be a surrender for the Iranians. So at the end of last year, Netanyahu and Trump got together. Trump said, I agree, the missiles and nukes that the Iranians still have are a problem. We have to act on this at some point. It just doesn't look like the Israelis want to do that in this quarter as they deal with Gaza. But over the next 12 months, that risk of another regional conflict is going to continue to be there the whole time. Unless the Iranians come to the table and are willing to essentially offer the Israelis everything they want, the Israelis are at some point poised to restart what they did last year, and the U.S. would follow. It's also possible this time around that the U.S. decides to lead such a campaign, believing that a short, sharp campaign against the Iranians would break their political resolve and result in really significant change. Over the next few weeks, though, it's volatile because the protests are ebbing. That's a driver towards de-escalation because that's what Trump latched onto for why he wanted to get involved. But U.S. military assets are moving into the region. There is the missiles and the nuclear program that are still to be dealt with. Trump does have the success of Maduro right behind him that has emboldened him to believe that other military operations could be just as successful if they're limited. And the U.S. did this with Iraq for about a decade of occasional airstrikes against the Iraqis to try to change Saddam Hussein's behavior. Sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. The U.S. could be moving back into that mold where airstrikes on Iran are a regular feature of Middle Eastern policy.
Yeah. I mean, let's hope that's not the case for everybody. I don't know Trump well, but I get the sense that's probably not what he wants to be embroiled in the long term. And Trump, as you said earlier, he's a deal maker. So let me ask you this. It might not be possible because America has just been sold as the great evil, to these folks. But they're under heavy sanctions, largely imposed on them by the U.S. They have a water crisis, as you mentioned. America could help, right? I mean, the carrot of, hey, become less anti-West or, whatever, treat your protesters better or whatever. And we can start loosening some of this stuff. We can start bringing you a ton of water. We can set up water treatment facility. Like, there's definitely carrots that could be played here. Are they possible, or are they just not possible because ideologically the regime has convinced itself, as well as the populace, can't ever work with the enemy?
Yeah, and I think I would say it's impossible with Khamenei still in power. Of course, he's old and he's got to go at some point. Once there's a new supreme leader, I think the possibility of cutting a deal with the U.S. that's not under severe military pressure, not like an open-ended campaign against the Iranians, I think it becomes more likely with a successor to Khamenei. We don't know who that's going to be. They might not know who that's going to be. It seems pretty likely that there's going to be a fair bit of power struggles over succeeding Khamenei. And it could result in a fundamental change of the Islamic Republic, where you're seeing things like maybe the Supreme Leader office is abolished. Maybe the president finally is given actual power. Things like that could happen in the aftermath of Khamenei as part of this like internal reformist push. So Khamenei's death is probably the biggest signpost towards real change in Iran.
And how old is he?
86, I believe, right around there.
He's up there. Yeah.
He's definitely up there. No, he's very much, this is, another decade of this is possible, right? But yeah, we're on the back foot, and many of the regime insiders know this, and they're preparing for it. But that being said, one of the tricks to extending an open hand to the Americans is that it could require the IRGC to dismantle their corrupt business empire. And they don't want to do that, because if investors are going to go into Iran, they don't want to do business with the IRGC. They want to build a dam because it's going to make them money. They don't want the IRGC taking a cut of it. There will be some investors, right, that would come into Iran that would do business with corrupt entities. That happens globally. But the scale to rehabilitate Iran's economy really requires internal reform as well. And we're seeing this in Venezuela, right? Like Exxon says, yeah, Venezuela is uninvestable. And it's mostly because of the corruption on the ground in Venezuela itself. Iran could be in the same situation where, maybe there is a fundamental change in their outreach to the U.S., but there's not a follow-on of investment into Iran, because who wants to do business in those environments? Maybe the Chinese do in localized areas, but it's still not enough to necessarily change and improve Iran's lifestyle. And then if that's to happen, if that's the case where Iran offers these concessions and then nothing gets better, that actually creates a scenario where they might go even further, to the far right, back into religious nationalist conservatism, because they tried and they got burned, and jilted lovers sort of effect. That has happened where movements shift away from their outreach because they get spurned, or the effects of it aren't what they expected.
Okay, so you're kind of going into some of my concluding questions here, which was, what's the best that could what's the best outcome we could hope for from this? And then secondarily, what's the worst outcome that could happen from this?
Let's start. The worst outcome, I think, is an Iranian civil war. one that doesn't involve just the Kurds and the Arabs and the Baluch, but a significant civil war between Persian factions and the IRGC against, say, elements of Artesh, the Iranian army. That is a possibility way down the line if the succession of Khamenei fails, and there is something like a Persian Spring that results in significant defections from the security forces, especially from the army. And then you start seeing a big civil war that would result in millions of refugees flowing into Pakistan and Turkey and Europe and the Americas. And the US would be under intense pressure to take some of these refugees in because of our pro-Iran democracy stance. And it would be like Cuba with Castro taking over. They would have a similar political dynamic where a lot of lobbying would take place here, even in our nativist moment, to bring those folks in. So I think that's the worst case. And of course, there's always that chance that they could have developed a nuclear weapon by then, and then you got a loose nuke in a civil war scenario. Second worst scenario, I think, is that the Iranians develop a nuclear weapon because of these recurrent attacks. And they could do so with North Korean help. They could do so maybe with Russian help. The Russians don't want them having nukes, but it's a possibility under enough attacks that they get some technical help. So if you have a beleaguered Iranian regime with nuclear weapons, now you have a North Korea in the Middle East with all of its volatility. And I think that would be probably your second worst scenario, is that the IRGC...
And with a religious fanatic finger on the trigger.
Exactly. And then that volatility could result in, well, if somebody's falling, if the regime is collapsing, what happens to the nukes? Do they give it to extremists? Do they fire it off in a direction to get their final revenge? Things like that become more probable under those circumstances. The best case that I think is realistic over the next 5 or 10 years is the shift towards a more moderate nationalist government. And I think here this model is Syria with Ahmed Jarrah, who was Al-Qaeda, and then he became a Syrian rebel faction. And now he's the president of Syria, shaking hands with American generals that were once hunting him. That's probably, and Syria is by no means, it's not a walk in the park. There's still significant security risks there. But that is the best that Syria could have gotten out of its civil war. Iran could get something that's similar from a series of elites that say, we need to focus on our near abroad. We need to give up on our ideological struggle, at least downplay them, and become more like China. Like we'll still say that we want to, spread communism and whatnot, but the Chinese don't do that anymore. The Iranians could choose that path as well. And I think that becomes more likely after Khamenei's death, where you have this evolution to your Islamic Republic run by the Revolutionary Guards. It's still corrupt. It's a hard place to do business, but it's more open to the world. It is an easier place to access, and it doesn't think about attacking Israel every few minutes.
Okay. Well, we will cross our fingers and hope for the best coming out of this. I've got a few concluding questions for you, Ryan. But again, first, I just want to say thanks so much again for taking the time out of your very busy schedule and all these real-time breaking developments to talk to us about this. And I'll just say I'd love to have you back on if and when there's more stuff to discuss. And I'll hope it won't be anytime soon, at least not for bad reasons.
Yeah, right? No, me too. I mean, there's always that possibility. We're talking about a Persian democracy. I mean, it's like 5%, but it's there.
Yeah. And I would love nothing more to have you back on in a week or two saying, oh my God, there's been a regime change and now everybody wants to partner with the West. And let's talk about what that's going to look like.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess right now, as best you can tell, do you see any material economic or financial market impacts from what's going on right now? Or are the markets just sort of in a wait and see stage?
I'd say short version of this, no. I think that Iranian volatility is starting to get priced into it. It's already been with the oil markets for a long time. And I think I've said before, the oil traders are great people because they know how to assess risk appropriately. If there's not a supply interruption, there's no reason to spike the oil prices. I think that right now, if the expectation is that if there is a U.S. intervention, it's limited, and then the Iranians do a limited intervention, and then we move on with our day until the next round. That's something that won't destabilize financial markets. It won't cause a recession. It doesn't involve the Hormuz scenario or attacks on Gulf energy. That will keep it contained. In the longer run, the problem is that the U.S. is going to get pulled into this dynamic that the Israelis are now pulled into, which is that they occasionally have to attack Iran to maintain deterrence, to gain advantage, to try to shape its behavior. And they have to keep doing that until Iran fundamentally changes the kind of geopolitical entity that it is. And that could be years down the line. Again, Saddam is the angle that I look at. They tried to get rid of his WMDs via airstrikes, and that eventually led to the ground invasion. I don't think we're looking at a ground invasion, But I do think that there's going to be greater and greater temptation that the U.S. is getting involved with Iran more from the air. And each time the Iranians are going to have to consider a more escalatory response. I don't think they're there in this scenario, but one of these days, an Iranian ballistic missile hitting major energy facilities, trying to close the Strait of Hormuz, destroying a tanker, something like that that could really rattle markets. I think that does grow with each one of these rounds.
Okay. You mentioned at the beginning that as best we know right now, there's somewhere between 2,000 and 12,000 casualties from these recent protests. Mm-hmm. Trump specifically said, don't kill the protesters or else I'm going to get involved and you're going to pay the price. Does he have to respond with some sort of show of force to those numbers?
I don't think he has to do anything in a war of choice. That was a red line that he set, like Obama's red line with Syria. That's an internal one. There's no legal mechanism that forces him to do anything. Will his credibility be damaged if he doesn't follow through? I'm not sure he had very much credibility in terms of Iranian internal affairs to begin with. The Iranian government's going to do what it's going to do. They changed their PR a bit. There was that one shopkeeper that they're no longer going to execute under this pressure. That's the most minor. That's probably the least that they could do to try to get that pressure off of them. It's a question of whether or not Trump cares about his credibility on threats towards Iran. And we've seen these threats go back and forth in other places like Russia and Ukraine, where he says he's going to do something and then doesn't follow through, or tariffs and things like that. So I don't think it links him and forces him to do anything. I think that the maneuver of an aircraft carrier to the region is the more significant change. Right. That suggests that they want to have the option for a significant escalation. And I think they're also going to be asking the Israelis, what is the effectiveness of a strike right now? Or should we wait for later in this year when we can do a joint strike together and have a much bigger impact? That I think will also matter in whether or not we see escalation over the next few days or the next few weeks.
Okay. The impression I'm getting from what you've told me, Ryan, correct me if this is the wrong impression, is my guess is you'd give 90+% probability to the fact that these protests are probably going to diminish. They may not go away. They could flash up again in the future, but you're not expecting the existing regime to really change anytime in the near future from what we're seeing going on right now.
Yeah, not in a substantial way, unfortunately. There will be some people that will lose their jobs, and the central bank head already has, and that's probably about it. Unless, again, Khamenei suddenly falls over, then we see a significant change, but that's not because of the protests.
Okay. A question here, how has this affected oil shipments to China so far? Has anything that's been going on impacted the flows of oil from Iran?
Not that I have seen, because the oil industry didn't go on strike. Again, that's an ideologically controlled industry because it's strategic. It shuts down. The Islamic Republic shuts down. So far, those still seem to be taking place and going out. If the U.S. does enter a Venezuela-style oil blockade, that could change. And I would think that Trump would be considering such an oil blockade as an option against the Iranians. I mean, there's been new sanctions issued as well. So that could be something that they decide to do. But so far, the flows are still going to China.
Okay. I'm just going to ask this question because this guy has been asking it every 2 minutes. How much damage did Israel suffer from Iranian missiles during the 12-day war?
I think the most impactful thing that happened to Israel was not the exhaustion of its air defenses, but a lot of utilization of hard-to-replace air defenses like THAAD, Arrow 2, and Arrow 3. Those are slow to replace. I have seen reports, estimates. The IDF will never tell you, right? But the Israelis used up to 25% of these advanced systems. Now that's still 75% of their it's been replenished since last June. But it was the air defense impact that really is an issue for the Israelis. The Iranians, the raw estimated math, big caveats on this, but the Iranians had at least 3,000 or so, 2,500 long-range ballistic missiles during the war. They fired up to 500 of them. They leaves them with 2,500 to 2,000 left. That might be enough to overwhelm the Israelis' air defenses, but then they're out of missiles, and they're out of missiles for years as they replenish it. So they don't want to fire them all. Mm-hmm. For the Israelis, it's the air defense game, because you can't win a war with missiles or air power alone. The Ukrainians and the Russians have demonstrated this. They're firing drones and missiles left and right. Nobody's winning. But you can break the political will of an adversary like Israel through civilian casualties. The Israelis are very civilian casualty averse. If they are having to endure ballistic missile strikes that are killing large numbers of Israelis on the ground, that will change the politics of Israel, right, the hawkishness of Israel in a really significant way. So it's the air defenses component that matters. They didn't lose any aircraft. They lost very few. I don't think there were any soldiers. There were some civilian casualties. There was some economic damage, of course, but then the economy rebounded in Q3 2025, just shot up because everybody delayed their business. They didn't cancel it. But the air defenses is the thing to watch. And that's one of the reasons I think Trump was complaining about the defense contractors here in the US, is that companies like Raytheon that are part of the Israeli air defense network, they just can't produce these replenishment anti-missile munitions at the scale that I think Trump wants, so he can re-escalate and not ensure that a major Hormashar ballistic missile lands in the middle of Tel Aviv and kills 100 civilians.
Okay. All right. Got one more question for you. Two more, but one more.
Yeah, no worries.
On the topic. But first, I just want to preface it by saying, Ryan, I appreciate so much, again, you coming on, but also just got a wealth of knowledge about the region. I think in our first interview we did, I gave you like a couple of minutes to give everybody your whole CV and how you have come to know so much about the region. So folks, if you want to get that on Ryan, go back and watch that. But you just seem to be extremely knowledgeable, extremely open-minded. I don't detect any bias one way or the other from you, except maybe just for hopes of peace and prosperity. Mm-hmm. You just kind of tell it like it is. That's why that's what I see, and that's why I keep having you back on. The question I'm going to ask is a question that I see in the comments when you and some of your colleagues from RANE are on here, which is, hey, RANE is got CIA ties, and these guys are deep staters, and there's whatever biases come with those assumptions. I just want to give you a chance to talk to that potential criticism that it's unfounded from coming from these people, as best I can tell, but I just don't want it hanging out there unaddressed. So what would you say?
I mean, RANE is an independent company. If we were getting deep state backing, I think I'd be living in a nicer house. I'd probably be living someplace other than the Philadelphia metro area as well. So there is that. A lot of these stories go back to the WikiLeaks hack with Stratfor way back in the day, which exaggerated the company's capabilities and exaggerated our influence. I wasn't part of the company at that time. I joined in 2017, but it exaggerated the status of the company with more or less everybody. And that was an affair that I think has lingered on social media for a long time. Our income comes from the vast majority are corporate clients, and they are coming to us because outlets like CNBC and Bloomberg, et cetera, keep saying geopolitical risk, geopolitical risk, geopolitical risk, and then they don't define it. And as one of the earliest purveyors of talking about geopolitics as a field, that gives us an advantage over some of our many competitors. We have many competitors, and some of them are much bigger than us in terms of both personnel and budget. Because they do more, they might not just be involved with risk analysis. They might also be involved in media. They might be involved in partnerships with foreign governments. We don't have any partnerships with foreign governments. We don't have any partnerships with the US government. Anybody can subscribe to us, and that does include some folks that just want access to our website. And that can be government entities, but it's also universities. Some of these folks might be surprised at how many NGOs come to us for geopolitical analysis as they're trying to decide if they want a humanitarian mission in a place like X, Y, and Z. But there's a big appetite for people to have geopolitics interpreted these days because the multipolar world is so confusing. So that's really what we do for a living. The market is there. It is, I wouldn't describe it as overly lucrative. If you could ever get a Wall Street Titan to back us, then it would be super lucrative. But Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, they all have geopolitical in-houses as well. And yeah, that's kind of what we do. And I do really want to emphasize, when we were bought out by RANE in 2020, that involved a almost total leadership change. I don't work for the same people that I did back then, although some of them are still around. That was a significant change for the direction of our company, where we kind of stopped being a magazine and started being more of a geopolitical consultancy for major companies, entities, NGOs, et cetera.
All right. Well, thank you for that great answer. I expect to have you and your colleagues from RANE on the channel more frequently going forward, just simply because the world seems to be becoming much more multipolar, and therefore understanding the geostrategic tectonic plates and how they're shifting becomes more and more important to understanding where things are going economically. And of course, at the end of the day, this is an investing channel, so that's why it matters so much. But it is it's such a privilege and a gift to be able to access you when we can and when you have time to come on this channel. So Ryan, again, I want to say thank you. For folks who would like to follow you and your work in between now and the next time you come on Thoughtful Money, where should they go?
You can find me on LinkedIn, which is where I tend to post some of the longer, like sort of hot takes. I'm occasionally using Twitter/X again, so you're welcome to follow that too. Because of the Saudi Emirati crisis, there wasn't any.
What's your handle there?
I'd have to check. It's like Ryan Bohl. I think it's Ryan.Bohl, something like that.
Okay, probably not too many Ryan Bohls on Twitter, but
yeah, there's not too many of them. There's just yeah. There's a coach somewhere that always gets in the SEO.
I got a famous soccer player in Australia with my name, so yeah.
So those are the two primary areas that I think you can look for connections. And on LinkedIn, I'm pretty open to having back and forth with folks if they're interested. Obviously, there's only so much I'm willing to always discuss, because again, you got to keep some of the stuff for the clients.
Sure, yeah, and it all might change tomorrow. I mean, it's the nature of your business, right?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, look, thank you so much for giving this real-time update to this audience. Folks on the live chat, please tell Ryan how much you appreciate him making the time to come and do this. Do the same thing, folks. If you're watching the replay, just put it in the comment section below. But thanks so much, Ryan. Again, we'll cross our fingers here for peace. I will be, I've been pretty vocal on X. I will be rooting for the people of Iran to get the type of future that they want and deserve. However that unfolds and whatever that is, time will tell. But, beyond that, let's hope the bloodshed gets kept to a minimum. And again, next time there's a big, important development in the story, I'd love to have you come back on here, Ryan.
I appreciate it, Adam. And I appreciate your audience as well. I've just checked in the comments now, and it seems like there's a lot of positive folks and constructive folks, always willing to have a constructive conversation on a variety of platforms.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Ryan. See you again soon. Everybody else, thanks so much for watching.
The point is, we're seeing lots of silver that is being accumulated by the central banks. That's $2,225,790,000 worth of silver has come into COMEX. In the first week or so of the month, Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, let's not forget about India, who's bought somewhere between 600 and 800 million ounces over the last 5 years. That's more than is on the COMEX and the LBMA combined. Most of the public has zero idea that there is a massive drive going on for gold and for silver. First week of September, you're seeing nearly $4 billion worth of metal stand for delivery. But this is what we've seen every single month. Now, we've always been an importer of silver, not always been, in fact, never, to my knowledge, been a net importer of gold. Both of them together signal a bigger move, a bigger trend.
Central banks are quietly stockpiling huge amounts of silver, with Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, and India leading the charge. Saudi Arabia has made small but notable purchases of silver via ETFs recently, which may signal a shift in behavior. China has bought 21 metric tons of gold so far this year, 2025. It's part of their strategy to diversify away from the dollar and align reserve assets with their global status. The notion that BRICS and other developing nations are considering silver more seriously due to its dual uses is being more widely reported. India alone has accumulated 600 to 800 million ounces in the last 5 years, more than what COMEX and LBMA hold combined. The US, traditionally an importer of silver but never of gold, is now importing both, a clear sign of a much larger global trend toward physical accumulation of precious metals. Andy, the president and CEO of Miles Franklin Precious Metals, highlights that what makes today's market different is the sheer scale of physical gold and silver being accumulated, not just by investors but by central banks, with Russia allocating it in its 2025 to 2027 budget and Saudi Arabia making ETF purchases. COMEX deliveries of gold and silver remain historically high, signaling strong demand for physical metal, while a weaker US dollar is further boosting gold and drawing silver into reserve diversification strategies. Analysts like Mike Maloney see silver poised for significant upside in a potential monetary reset, though claims of India's massive silver accumulation and extreme delivery spikes remain unverified. Experts also warn that paper metals may not provide true protection in a crisis, driving the push toward physical holdings. Andy believes the public, meanwhile, remains largely unaware of this massive shift toward physical metals. As we dive into the video, don't forget to hit the bell icon and subscribe so you don't miss any updates.
Well, I think that what differentiates this market from anything I've ever seen, Ivan, and I've been doing this now for almost 36 years, is the amount of physical demand that is being accumulated. Now, we've talked at length about the central banks that have been buying gold. We're seeing action with the central banks buying silver. Now, of course, it started with Russia saying they were going to add it to their stockpile. First time I've ever seen a government do that. And then it mitigated moved towards China, talking to guys like Sean Kuhn from Dolly Varden. He says, look, Andy, the Chinese, who are the second largest producer in the world, they told David Morgan they're the first, by the way, but needless to say, they're massive producers. Sean says they're flying all around Latin America, in particular places like Peru, even all the way up to Mexico, and pulling metal out of the ground before it's even called silver. They're buying doré, they're buying concentrate. They're paying double what the West will do to disintermediate the whole market, sending it back to China for refining. So you have the first or second largest producer in the world finds it significant enough to fly around the world and buy doré and concentrate right out of the ground from the miners, directly from the miners, and then sending it back to do so under the cover of anonymity, so to speak. No one really knows how much they're buying or what they're getting, but Sean can validate that is indeed what is happening. You look at the Central Bank of Saudi Arabia, disappointing as it may be that they bought huge amounts of SLV, maybe one of the worst products I've ever seen ever in my career, because just as a side note, the short position right now in SLV is 53.97 million shares,
Wow.
which is it's grotesque, it's ridiculous. And remember what the prospectus said, BlackRock said, there could come a time when there's not enough silver to cover those short positions, buyer beware. But the point is, we're seeing lots of silver that is being accumulated by the central banks. What is really different to me, as far as I'm concerned, is the amount of silver that is coming into the COMEX. And, last week I jotted down some numbers. In month to date in September, the number of contracts, and this was last week, I'm sure it's much more now, that stood for delivery was 10,599 contracts. Let's do the math real quick. 10,599 contracts times each contract weight being 5,000 ounces is 52,995,000 ounces. We'll multiply that, let's just call it by 42. That's $2,225,790,000 worth of silver has come into COMEX in the first week or so of the month. And this is what we've seen over and over and over again. The point I want to get across here is that when you have countries, Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, let's not forget about India, who's bought somewhere between 600 and 800 million ounces over the last 5 years. That's more than is on the COMEX and the LBMA combined. And now you see it happening in the United States. At this level, the people don't just have the most money that are standing for delivery. Now, when we say stand for delivery, mind you, this is going into COMEX. A lot of it leaves. A lot of it doesn't leave. So regardless if it's leaving COMEX or being put into an eligible account, not registered, meaning it's not available for sale, it's going into strong hands. To this degree, these people are not only the most well-funded traders on the planet, i.e. the central banks, the commercial banks, the very sophisticated traders that can stand for delivery on COMEX to the tune of billions of dollars every month since November, since the election, but they're also the most well-informed. And I think that's the most important thing to understand, is that the people at this level who swim in circles of 9-figure monthly acquisitions are not doing things just for kicks. They're doing it because they understand where we are going. They know the playbook. They are at the highest level of information. And that's what I take away from really where we're at this moment, is that price is relevant, but price is a tool of misdirection, allowing the big money to position before all of the people that you and I call friends outside of what we do for a living talking about this stuff. The people who may be very smart, very bright, very well read, arguably just reading the wrong shit. And that's the problem. So most of the public has zero idea that there is a massive drive going on for gold and for silver in terms of delivery. Just as a side note, in the first 5 days or so, 6 days of the September contract, which is a non-delivery month, 3,626 gold contracts and 100 ounces apiece stood for delivery. So you're talking $1.5 billion there too.
Wow.
So in just the first week of September, you're seeing nearly $4 billion worth of metal stand for delivery. But this is what we've seen every single month. Now, we've always been an importer of silver. Not always been, in fact, never, to my knowledge, been a net importer of gold. Both of them together signal a bigger move, a bigger trend, and that is that the smartest money in the world understands that there is a rush for physical acquisition of metal, bypassing the paper promises. So there you go. Crazy times, brother, and I think we're just beginning in silver.
Andy points out that central banks and BRICS sovereigns Russia, China, India, and Saudi Arabia are accelerating gold and silver accumulation, often buying ore and concentrates directly from miners, while the West relies more on paper vehicles like SLV. Russia confirmed BRICS talks on a new precious metals exchange with its own pricing, clearing, and auditing, reducing reliance on the Western system, while silver is gaining traction as a reserve asset, with reports of Russian buying and Saudi Arabia making first ETF-linked silver purchases. Analysts warn Western price suppression looks increasingly like misdirection, with BRICS building parallel commodity infrastructure to secure physical supply. Experts predict gold will remain strong, and silver could see outsized upside given its smaller market, though volatility and delivery bottlenecks may increase.
The only saving grace is, and maybe I would like to think they're not misinformed. See, if you and I bought SLV, we can never take possession. They can, because it's the amount that they purchased. You have to have a certain amount, and it's called a basket. If you are able to redeem a basket, which I don't know the exact amount, 20, 30, 40, $50 million worth, they can. So I'll give you an example. Kyle Bass, when he was running the fund for the Texas Teachers Union years ago, they bought, if I'm not mistaken, $1 billion worth of GLD. They stood for delivery. Saudi Arabia can do the same thing here. They do have the right to stand for delivery, and most of that metal, if I'm not mistaken, is held in the LBMA. So because they bought such a significant amount, they can stand for delivery. And maybe they had a reason behind doing that I'm not sure. For you and I, buying SLV is as dumb as a mud wall. Not only do you pay the capital gains for collectibles when you sell it, you can never take possession. It's custodied by JP Morgan and BlackRock. Of course, JP Morgan, as we have identified multiple times, paid the largest fine that the Justice Department had ever handed out at that point, $920 million or so, for manipulating the silver market. Well, and that was kind of, and the reason that I think that they got off so easily, I believe that this was done at the behest of the central bank, who gave them the green light to do this. And there are bigger reasons at play for holding down the monetary metals, but that's for another discussion. Simply to say, it was far more. In fact, you could argue that it was far more than just spooking. It was manipulation, and it was at one point thought it would be RICO charges, because in essence it's like the hitman kills someone, well, they can go after the mob boss because the mob boss ordered it. Well, the point of it is that who up the chain of JP Morgan understood this? Is it just the head trader, Michael Nowak, who was the sacrificial lamb that was put in jail for a couple of years? Or, I don't know. The point of it is that this is something that you can only manipulate a market, Ivan, for an extended period of time by pushing it in the direction that it is going. And I've been doing this for almost 36 years. Most of the time, the world didn't want gold and silver. They wanted U.S. bonds and U.S. stocks and real estate. They wanted what was, when things got scary, there was a rush to the dollar. What is happening now is that the big money around the world has become motivated, coordinated, and sophisticated, and they understand what's happening. The big money around the world largely being, when I say that, I'm talking the BRICS countries, in particular Russia, China, now Saudi Arabia, India. All of these countries understand, and they have been using the spoofing or the manipulation or the suppression of the metals market against us. In other words, hold the paper price down in the West and then go all around the world and drain the supplies, especially off of exchanges around the globe that don't affect the price. The price is set in the West, so if you smash the price down on paper here and then buy it up there, and there, boy, that works out well. And they're smart enough to see the big picture. That's what they're doing. And then they go as far, and just ask yourself, the second largest producer of silver in the world, the largest producer of gold, don't sell an ounce. They fly all over the world and buy gold and silver in doré, which is a crudely refined bar, in concentrate, which is a byproduct of it, right from the miners, which completely disintermediates the amount and disintermediates the market and the commercial banks. They're thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. They're playing 3D chess, we're playing checkers. So I think that this is something that is being used against us without saying so. They get it. I'll evidence it this way. I've spent a lot of time talking about the BRICS, and the BRICS grain exchange is something that is under development. And I listened to an interview about the guy who's running it a year ago, and he said, we here in the BRICS produce and consume in the global south more wheat than they do in the West. Yet we have no control over its price because that is controlled on COMEX. But with the development of the BRICS grain exchange, that will change. Now,
Wow.
They understand what we're doing with the precious metals, with the base metals. All of the things that we have suppressed for various reasons are now being used against us. It's jiu-jitsu. The premise being you use your opponent's leverage against them. And this is exactly what's happening right now, man.
Will central banks' increasing use of silver lead to a structural revaluation to that of gold? What potential effects may the establishment of a BRICS precious metals exchange have on shifting global pricing power and diminishing the importance of Western markets? If you enjoy the content, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and press the bell icon for timely updates. We appreciate your support, and thank you for being with us.
We've not only taken out the big problem that we had with silver at 3,300. There was such strong technical resistance. There was also technical resistance at about 35, but it just sailed through there. And we'll go back to a daily chart so we can get a better idea of what we're looking at. $40 is our next anticipated level. We could encounter resistance. I'm not really expecting any real resistance there. Our studies right now are looking for $42 on the upside, and it is based upon not a daily, but rather a monthly. And so that's the thing. You can, as I said, we've got to go way far back, really compress this chart before we see the last time. Silver seems to have locked on, but the last time was 2014.
Silver has broken above the long-standing $35 resistance, reaching levels not seen in over a decade due to tight supply and strong industrial demand from sectors like solar and electrification. Prices have climbed near $39 to $40, with analysts targeting $42 next and the potential for $45 by 2026. Institutional forecasts by Bank of America, Citigroup, Saxo Bank, and others also converge on a silver price around $40 by late 2025 or early 2026. Gary Wagner, a seasoned technical analyst and the host of the Gold Forecast, explains that silver has recently surged past significant resistance levels, reaching its highest point in over 13 years. This upward momentum is attributed to a combination of factors, including strong industrial demand, particularly in renewable energy sectors like solar and electric vehicles, and a persistent supply deficit. As of August 30, 2025, silver is trading near $37.95 per ounce. Silver has been trailing gold but is now starting to catch up with impressive momentum. However, gold has built strong momentum, rising from 2,300 in March 2024 to over 3,500 before consolidating into a symmetrical triangle. This pattern often leads to breakouts in the prevailing trend, which remains bullish. After pulling back to the lower channel, traders went long near 3,410. A close above 3,473 would confirm the breakout, opening the door for a new leg higher. Despite recent gains, the setup points to more upside ahead. As we dive into the video, remember to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. We value your thoughts, so drop a comment below and give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed the content.
Lagging behind gold, obviously. Yeah. This, of course, is a daily. And what I was looking at, and I'll flash it back, was a monthly. So you can see the performance this month from 37.48 up to 39.72. Quite a move. 2.42%. $2.42, up 6.5% over the month. And the thing is that this red line was drawn in yesterday because that's where silver had closed yesterday. And so we have not seen these prices really since February 2013. It's definitely the bullseye target right now. Could it go higher? Yes. Yeah. It is reacting in a much more sensitive manner to follow gold, which it was not. And now we're seeing it play catch up, so to speak. So I wouldn't be surprised to see silver move even higher than that. And here you can see this is my upside target right there, 42.30. And that's the first target. If it breaks strongly through there, 44 would be the next upside target above that. A daily Japanese candlestick chart. And of course, I'm using a combination of studies, but basically trend analysis, Elliott wave, and pattern recognition, such as this symmetrical triangle that we're witnessing. And what we notice is we've had a runaway bull market. If we move it back a little bit, you can see that as you know, we're sitting at 2,300 in March of 2024. Not too much to move it to 3,200, 3,400. So we've got 1,000. And then it runs up to the all-time record intraday high, well above 3,500. Viewers, I am looking at a futures chart. So the numbers will be a little bit different than spot. Yeah. And then we knew, at least our model predicted, we were headed for a correction, and that's what I thought we would see. But typically in a correction, you get something like an A, a B, and then a C, and then you go back to the motive phase, a 5 count of bullish waves, 1, 3, and 5. In between, you get corrective waves 2 and 4. But what happened was when we saw the market go up and hit this top, we had already drawn in the compression triangle and come down. We realized that this was not unfolding as a simple ABC, but something a little bit more complex. This is simply called a symmetrical triangle. The idea behind the symmetrical triangle, of course, is you're going to have a series of rallies followed by a series of shallow corrections, shallow rallies, until you typically get to the E wave. Following the E wave, as the model predicts, and not so well this time, you get what's called a thrust. A thrust is simply when prices break above, that's the wrong one, but is simply when prices break above the resistance line and you get that hardcore breakout. We certainly didn't see that. And so we watched gold go back into the channel. Let me just kind of blow this up a little bit. Go back into the channel and trade back down to the lower end of the channel. At this point, we realized since it did not occur here, meaning a thrust or a breakout, this would be, if it's going to do it at all, this would be the time. This is when we got our subscribers long at about 34.10. We had enough confidence that it's probably not going to break to the downside, because, Jeremy, a symmetrical triangle doesn't necessitate a breakout to the upside or the downside. Either can happen. Typically, we see it go to the prevalent trend direction, which of course is higher, and that's exactly what we saw. Now, today, we're right at the resistance line. I hope our viewers can see it. I'll blow it up a little bit more, but as you can see, we've just gone over that a little bit. And so this was the breakout that I have been waiting for. And I believe that a solid close above, let's call it 34.73, will signal that we are going to see a strong breakout to the upside, moving gold substantially higher, even though it's already traveled from 33.58 to 34.78. So it's gone a significant amount, but we think that there's a lot more room to the upside right now, as long as we get an effective close above this resistance line, which it clearly looks as though that's a highly probable outcome.
Gary highlights that the US dollar index is exhibiting a notably bearish technical outlook, influenced by its performance relative to key moving averages. Recently, the dollar has fallen below both the 50-day and 200-day moving averages, signaling a weakening trend. The 50-day moving average, currently around 98.1, is acting as immediate support, while the 200-day moving average, positioned at approximately 102.7, remains well above current prices. Additionally, the 50-day moving average has crossed below the 200-day moving average, forming a death cross, a classic bearish signal in technical analysis. Gary thinks that this alignment suggests a shift toward more bearish market sentiment. Furthermore, the relative strength index is hovering near neutral levels, around 50, indicating a lack of strong momentum in either direction. Covering all the scenarios, we can say that the US dollar is currently facing significant technical headwinds, with both short-term and long-term moving averages indicating a bearish trend. Traders and investors should remain cautious, monitoring for potential further declines if the dollar fails to reclaim key support levels.
This is our simple 50-day moving average, and that's what we would look at for short-term market expectations. If it's above the 50-day on a short-term basis, we are in a solid bullish demeanor. The 100-day is intermediate, and then the long-term is the 200-day. And so I've highlighted the 200-day is in red. Green is the 50-day. It melted through the 50-day, came down and melted. You see how exaggerated the moves were on the days when it broke through the 50 as well as the 200. And so that's significant, because what that tells us is that on a technical basis, on a very long-term basis, the dollar is extremely bearish and has more room to the downside. In terms of targets, if it continues to drop 95, I'm basing that on a Fibonacci retracement data set that beginning of May at 89, up to the record top that we've seen recently at 114. And then the important numbers are drawn in. This is the 78% retracement. This, of course, is our starting point. As you can see, this is the 38. This is the 50. And the fact of the matter is, we're probably close to the, we've even broken through the 61. And in terms of corrections, 61 is a very deep correction, but acceptable. 78 is acceptable, but actually fairly rare. And a break below 78 would mean that we're not looking at a simple correction, but a flip from a corrective expression in a bullish market to a fully bearish market. If we broke below 78, that would signal that. You notice also, when you look at this chart, the 61.8, it comes down, it tests this area, it pops back up, and look, it finds resistance at the 50%. Then it comes back down, breaks through it, and you can see all of the attempts that came in. Let's go ahead and widen this. All the attempts that came in to break back above that, and all of them were unsuccessful. And because of that, that tells me the dollar absolutely has a higher probability of going down than going up.
Yeah.
And the next target, as I said, would be about 95 on the dollar index.
Silver is showing strong bullish momentum, breaking key resistance levels and catching up with gold, while gold itself remains in a bullish breakout setup. Conversely, the US dollar is under technical pressure, with long-term and short-term indicators pointing toward further weakness. These dynamics suggest a favorable environment for precious metals, though investors should remain vigilant to potential market corrections and shifts in momentum. How might the dollar's ongoing weakness impact silver and gold prices in the coming months? What are the key levels investors should watch for to confirm continued bullish momentum in silver and gold? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. We'd be delighted to hear them. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos and give this one a thumbs up if you found it helpful. We appreciate you sharing in our adventure.
And the price of gold has, it's more than doubled, actually tripled in the last couple of years. So the thing with gold, just in U.S. dollars, going from say $1,500 per ounce to $3,500 per ounce, which was the recent all-time high. What really happened is the dollar has gone down significantly relative to gold. It's a weakening of the dollar. Now, the dollar has performed much better against other currencies. Recently, very recently, last 4 or 5 months, the dollar has gone down, the major indices, but that was from a fairly high level. It actually got quite strong against all the other major currencies, so I expect the dollar to get weaker against other major currencies. But if you're talking about gold, I would expect the opposite, that the price of gold would go up, which means that all the other currencies are falling even faster. So I would expect the Aussie dollar to get stronger relative to the US dollar. I do expect it to go higher. There's no way that gold is going to double or triple, and silver won't be along for the ride. So you can see $100 silver at some point and even higher from there.
Gold has jumped from $1,500 to $3,500 an ounce in just a few years, not because gold changed, but because the US dollar lost value against it. Though the dollar recently strengthened against other currencies, it's expected to weaken further, with all major currencies losing purchasing power even faster. JP Morgan notes that central banks are accelerating de-dollarization, cutting dollar reserves and boosting gold holdings, with the dollar's share of global FX reserves now below 60%, its lowest in 20 years. Meanwhile, silver is likely to follow gold's rise, potentially hitting $100 or more per ounce. Jim Rickards, an American lawyer, economist, and investment banker turned financial commentator, mentions the U.S. is deliberately pursuing a weaker dollar under what's being called a Mar-a-Lago Accord, tying tariffs, trade policy, and even military protection to currency values. Morgan and Reuters highlight expectations of a weaker U.S. dollar ahead. Asset management models suggest the dollar is overvalued by 10 to 20% against currencies like the euro and yen. At the same time, a softer dollar through 2025 is seen supporting emerging markets, attracting investors toward higher-yielding assets outside the U.S. However, Jim Rickards predicts the U.S. will devalue the dollar, but partners must not devalue their currencies in response. As a result, currencies like the Aussie dollar, sterling, and Swiss franc are expected to strengthen because the U.S. is actively forcing it. To ensure you don't miss any updates, don't forget to hit the bell symbol and subscribe as soon as the video starts. If you like the content, please let us know by leaving a comment below.
I would expect the Aussie dollar to get stronger relative to the U.S. dollar. But there's a very specific reason for that. There's a lot of buzz around the world of the BRICS are coming up with an alternative currency, and people are getting out of U.S. Treasuries and losing confidence in the U.S. dollar. U.S. budget deficits are out of control. The U.S. debt is out of control, et cetera. And none of that is basically true. These are talking points, but they have to be put in a context. The U.S. debt, $37 trillion, that's a big number for sure. But you can't think about that without comparing it to the resources. What is the GDP behind the debt? What are the assets on the other side of the balance sheet? And those kinds of things the Trump administration is talking about. And so one of the most influential advisors in the White House right now is Stephen Moran. He's an economist, but he wrote a paper last November on basically reconfiguring the entire global trading system. Pretty big claim. In there, he calls for something called the Mar-a-Lago Accord. And by the way, that was the title of Chapter 6 of my book, Aftermath, which came out in 2019, last time I was in Australia. So I'll take credit for coming up with the name. But his version of the Mar-a-Lago Accord looks at tariffs, trade, and exchange rate values, and kind of getting to your question, Jordan, about the Aussie dollar. Now, let's say I put 20% tariff on it. I'm the United States, and I put a 20% tariff on a trading partner. So some goods are, let's just say 100, it could be 100 million or whatever, but 100 as a measure, and I throw a 20% tariff on it, now it's 120. But what if the trading partner devalues its currency by 15%? So it was at par, let's say hypothetically, and you drop it from 100 to 100 down to 85 to 100. Well, that negates the impact of the tariff, because yes, the tariff marks up the price, but if you're the producer and you can lower your local currency costs, your labor costs and so forth by devaluing your currency, you dilute the impact of the tariff. So what he is saying, and indirectly what the White House is saying to U.S. trading partners, is we're going to put these tariffs on, so that's a given, but don't you dare devalue your currency. Sure. We're going to devalue the dollar. And any trading partner that tries to offset the tariffs by devaluing his currencies, there are going to be consequences to that. And he uses what I call the traffic light system. He says red, yellow, green. In the U.S., that's traffic light. But he said we're going to divide U.S. trading partners into 3 categories. So green, you're a friend, you work with us, we've negotiated the tariffs, you accept the tariffs, and you accept the fact that we're going to devalue the dollar. Yellow, you're okay, you're not an enemy, but you're not our best friend, and you may suffer higher tariffs. Red, you're an adversary, clearly China and Russia. I think it's a mistake with Russia, but China and Russia would be in that category. You're going to get tariffs, if not sanctions, etc. But in addition, this is where it gets tricky. He injects national security considerations. Like, wait a second, this guy's an economic advisor, maybe a Fed governor, but what's he doing talking about national security? Sounds like Henry Kissinger. But he said, if you're in the green category, you will get the benefit of U.S. military protection. Sure. You'll get the nuclear umbrella and more. If you're yellow, we may work with you, and if you're red, you can expect that we'll be in an adversarial position. So the significance of that is he's putting military might and security guarantees behind his claims about the U.S. dollar and exchange rates. Now, that's only been done twice in U.S. history. One was between 1971 and 1974, when Richard Nixon closed the gold window. It suspended the ability of foreign trading partners to redeem dollars for gold. The second time this was done, where the goal was to devalue the dollar, was 1985. James Baker was Secretary of the Treasury. Ronald Reagan was president. But this Baker really took the lead on this. And using some of these indices I mentioned, the dollar was at an all-time high, and Baker said, no, it's not good enough. We have to devalue the dollar. So the dollar dropped about between 15 and 20%, depending on the cross rate at the time. So here's the third instance of the U.S. engineering a devalued dollar. This isn't the markets doing this. This is the U.S. Treasury insisting on it. So I look at the Aussie dollar, sterling, Swiss francs, euro, and say, you're all going to get stronger because the U.S. wants that. The U.S. is forcing that to happen and backing it up with some pretty nice rewards, carrots on the one hand, but a stick if not.
Jim Rickards recalls that since 2010, central banks have shifted from being net sellers to consistent buyers of gold, led by Russia, China, and others steadily accumulating reserves. China, Russia, Turkey, and India have led global central bank gold buying in recent years. China resumed reporting reserve increases in 2022 to 23, adding over 150 tons in early 2023. Russia keeps buying domestic gold while cutting U.S. treasuries. Turkey continues heavy purchases despite economic strains. And India steadily grows reserves while reducing dollar reliance. Eastern European banks like those in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic have also accelerated gold accumulation. Overall, BRICS nations now account for the bulk of central bank demand, far outpacing Western buyers. In addition to this, central banks now hold 36,000 tons of gold, surpassing their treasury holdings in value for the first time since 1996, valued at approximately $4.5 trillion versus $3.5 trillion in treasuries. For the last 3 consecutive years, central banks have purchased over 1,000 metric tons of gold annually, roughly double the pace seen in the preceding decade. A World Gold Council survey shows 76% of central banks plan to increase gold holdings over the next 5 years, while nearly 75% expect to reduce exposure to US dollar assets, a sign of accelerating de-dollarization. Jim believes this central bank buying creates a price floor for gold while leaving unlimited upside, making it a strong long-term play. Now let's delve into the interview.
Well, you're exactly right, Jordan, about the central bank buying, and the turning point. You can actually chart this was 2010, but right after the global financial crisis of 2008. From 1970 to 2010, central banks and finance ministries, sovereign wealth funds were net sellers of gold every single year. Beginning in 2010, central banks collectively became net buyers of gold. Russia has more than tripled its gold reserves from about 600 metric tons to almost 3,000 metric tons. I guess it's gone up closer to 5 times. Same thing with China, from about 600 metric tons to 3,000 metric tons. But we've also seen Japan go from 600 to 900 metric tons, etc. Kazakhstan, Vietnam, Philippines, Mexico, Turkey, Iran. Iran's not transparent, but they've been buying gold, etc. So you have this fairly large group of central banks who are buying gold. Where are the sellers going? So between 1970 and 1980, the U.S. sold 1,000 tons. We went from 9,000 metric tons to about 8,100, just a little over 8,000 metric tons. But the U.S. stopped cold. We never sold any gold after 1980. And there are reasons for that. Probably don't have time to go into them. They're highly technical. But so the U.S. has stopped selling gold. We're no longer a seller. We've just stopped at 8,133 metric tons. So the sellers went away. The buyers continued. They will continue going forward. And what's interesting from a gold investor's point of view, central banks and finance ministries are actually very smart buyers. They don't chase the market up. They buy the dips. I hate to use cliches, but they buy the dips. They put in just steady orders. They're not out to buy the whole everything they need at once. It'll be 20 tons a month, which Russia did. Central Bank of Russia was very transparent. By the way, just as a quick aside, Elvira Nabiullina is the head of the Central Bank of Russia. In my view, she's the only central banker in the world who actually understands her job. But she put 25% of Russia's reserves in physical gold stored in Russia between 2010 and 2022, which was the beginning of the war in Ukraine. So what did the U.S. do? Well, the U.S. and Europe froze $300 billion worth of U.S. Treasury securities that Russia had bought lawfully. They shipped oil, got dollars, bought Treasury securities, trusted the United States, which was, hindsight, turned out to be a mistake. So there are about 200 billion of Treasury security, Russian-owned Treasury securities in Euroclear. That's all been frozen. And the U.S. does it all the time. We're good at freezing things. But now they're stealing it. They're actually seizing it and using it and the interest on it as collateral for loans to Ukraine so that Ukraine can buy weapons to fight Russia. So Russia's own money is being used to fight Russia via Ukraine. But why hasn't Russia crumbled? Well, the answer is they had $150 billion in gold that the U.S. can't touch, can't freeze, can't seize. And that's one of the nice things about gold. It's not digital. I can't hack it. It's just there. Unless you want to invade Russia, which is a whole different thing. And one of the ironies is when the U.S. put all these sanctions on Russia, every sanction you can think of, they've failed. But one of the reasons was they had gold, and Russia has actually made $50 billion in mark-to-market profits on their gold reserves. So on the one hand, we are stealing their treasury securities, but by doing so, we're helping to create geopolitical risk, drive up the price of gold. And Russia has at this point, more than $50 billion profit on the gold. So kind of what goes around comes around. Now, here's the thing. From a gold investor's point of view, I like this. This is what is called an asymmetric trade, meaning with a central bank buy, you have a floor. It's not a hard floor. There's no guarantee, but you have a de facto floor under the price of gold, but you have unlimited upside. So you can buy gold with some confidence that it's not going to go down a lot because the central banks will just buy it. At the same time, the sky's the limit in terms of where it might go. So it makes gold a very attractive trade. I should be clear, we are not at the frenzy stage yet. This rally has a long way to go. And the reason is it is a precious metal, exactly as you described, Jordan, but it's also an industrial input. And so the price moves on both vectors. So as a precious metal, I do expect it to go higher. There's no way that gold is going to double or triple, and silver won't be along for the ride. So you can see $100 silver at some point and even higher from there. But at the same time, if we're going into a recession, which I expect we are, and manufacturing is declining and everywhere from China and the U.S. as well, Europe, all over really, then there might be less demand on the industrial side, although it's demand for electronics is still strong. So you've got sort of two forces. It's going to go up on the precious metals vector, but maybe lag a little bit in terms of the industrial input vector. But on net, I do expect silver to go up.
Do you think central banks' move toward gold signals the beginning of a new monetary order? Could silver outperform gold in the years ahead as industrial demand recovers? If you have any comments, please share them here. In order to receive our latest updates, please subscribe and leave this educational video a review. We appreciate you coming along on this journey